There is a courtyard in the City of London, a few hundred feet from the Thames, wedged between Cannon Street Station and the river. It has a name, the Steelyard. Most people who walk past it assume it has something to do with steel, with industry, with the modern city built on top of whatever was here before. It doesn't. The Steelyard was a walled compound, a city inside the city. For 300 years, it was staffed entirely by foreign merchants who paid lower taxes than English citizens, operated under their own laws, and answered to no English authority. English kings granted them these privileges willingly because they needed these merchants more than these merchants needed them. The men who lived in the Steelyard came from Hamburg, Lübeck, Bremen, Cologne, and Danzig. They were part of something that had no king, no army, no capital city, and no written constitution, and somehow ran the economy of Northern Europe for over 400 years. It was called the Hanseatic League, and almost no one alive today knows it existed. That alone should stop you. But what stops me more is what it actually was, and how quietly it has been forgotten. Because this is not a story about a trading company. This is a story about the most successful alternative to government that Western civilization ever built. And I want to show you exactly how it worked and why. By the end of this video, you'll understand why it had to disappear. Let me start with the math, because the scale of this thing is genuinely hard to process. The League operated from approximately 1241 to 1669, 428 years. For comparison, the United States has existed for less than 250. The League predated the printing press, the Protestant Reformation, the discovery of the Americas, the English Civil War, and the entire modern concept of the nation-state, and it outlasted all of them. At its peak, around 200 cities were members, not countries, cities, stretching from London in the west to Novgorod in what is now Russia, from Bergen in Norway to Cologne in Germany. 15 modern countries, no central government coordinating any of it, just cities that agreed to follow shared rules because the alternative was watching someone else control everything, and the trade was everything. The 6 commodities that medieval Europe could not survive without were salt, dried herring, grain, timber, furs, and cloth. The Hanseatic League controlled the supply chain of all 6. Salt came from Lüneburg, herring came from the Baltic coast, grain came from eastern cities like Danzig, timber and furs moved from the Russian interior through Novgorod, cloth came from Flanders through Bruges. Every link in that chain passed through a Hanseatic city. Every transaction was weighed on a Hanseatic scale, recorded in a Hanseatic ledger, and shipped on a Hanseatic vessel, a flat-bottomed cargo ship called the cog, standardized by the League so that loading, unloading, and calculating freight costs were identical in every port from London to Riga. They invented container shipping, 700 years before anyone called it that. But here's the question nobody asks. How does a trading network with no government, no army, and no legal enforcement mechanism hold together for 4 centuries? What stops a member city from defecting the moment the rules become inconvenient? Because the answer to that question is what makes this story so strange and so relevant to right now. The answer was something they called the verbote, exclusion. If a city violated League rules, undersold agreed prices, broke the commercial code, dealt independently with a partner the League had collectively sanctioned, it was expelled. And expulsion was not just embarrassing, it was economic death. A city cut from the Hanse lost access to every port, every warehouse, every credit line the League controlled. You could not import salt. You could not export grain. Your merchants became strangers in every city that mattered. No violence, no siege, no army at the gate. They simply made you invisible. The Verbo was more effective than any military force in Europe, and for most of the League's existence, the threat of it was enough. Nobody tested it twice. But when the League needed something beyond exclusion, it turned out they could do that too. And what happened in 1370 is the moment I keep coming back to, because it should not have been possible. In 1370, the League went to war with Denmark, not because a king declared it, not because a government voted on it, because Danish King Valdemar IV had attacked a Hanseatic fleet and seized the cargo. The merchant cities mobilized a naval force, blockaded Danish ports, and forced a settlement that no one in medieval Europe had ever seen before, and has never seen since. The Peace of Stralsund, signed in 1370, gave the Hanseatic League the right to approve or veto who could become King of Denmark. Read that again. A confederation of traders with no territory, no crown, no divine mandate, had just acquired sovereignty over a monarchy. Merchant cities held veto power over a king. No parliament passed this. No pope authorized it. They simply won it because they controlled the economy that Denmark needed to survive, and everyone in that negotiating room understood that perfectly. And if you thought that was the peak of what they were capable of, it only gets more extraordinary from here. The 4 Kontors, the League's permanent foreign trading posts, were not embassies. They were self-governing compounds in the heart of foreign cities. The Steelyard in London, the Bruges Kontor in Flanders, the Bergen Kontor in Norway, which controlled the entire dried cod trade that fed Catholic Europe during Lent, and the Novgorod Kontor in Russia, giving the League direct access to the fur and wax routes of the eastern interior. Each Kontor was walled, each operated under Hanseatic law, each paid reduced customs duties negotiated directly with foreign rulers who could not afford to refuse. The merchants who lived in them were not diplomats. They were not soldiers. They were accountants and warehouse managers and ship captains. And they held more real economic power in their host cities than most of the nobles who technically governed them. For 300 years, the Steelyard in London was effectively a sovereign territory on English soil. And English kings, from the Plantagenets through the Tudors, maintained it because the credit lines and trade flows it represented were simply irreplaceable. Until Queen Elizabeth I closed it in 1598, quietly, with no declaration of war, no major diplomatic incident. She just revoked the privileges, and the merchants went home. That moment, 1598, is one of the earliest signs that something was shifting. Not a defeat, not a collapse, a withdrawal. The League was pulling back, and the question is why. 3 forces converged in the same century, and understanding all 3 explains not just why the League faded, but why it had to. First, nation-states with real navies. England, the Netherlands, and Sweden were no longer content to let merchant confederations control the trade that their economies depended on. They began competing directly, not as customers, but as rivals. And they had something the League could never match: the ability to pass laws giving their own citizens preferential treatment. The League was built to compete with other merchants. It had no answer for governments that simply changed the rules. Second, the Atlantic opened. The discovery of the Americas in 1492 began pulling European wealth westward. The Baltic herring, the Russian furs, the Eastern grain, the commodities that had made the League indispensable, slowly became less central than silver from Peru and spices from the East Indies. The trade routes that the League had been built to control were no longer the most important routes in the world. Third, and this is the detail that almost never gets mentioned, the League had no mechanism for changing itself. It was a voluntary association of equal cities. No city could force another to adapt. No leadership structure could mandate reform. The same feature that made it resilient for 4 centuries. The complete absence of central authority made it incapable of responding as a unified body when the world reorganized itself around empires. It was built to be fair, and fairness, it turned out, has no answer for a king who simply decides the rules no longer apply to him. By 1669, most of the 200 member cities had already quietly stopped participating, not expelled, not conquered, just absent. They had found other arrangements, other partners, other ways to survive in a world that now ran on charters and colonies and royal trading companies with military backing. The League let them go. It had no instrument for preventing it. The last formal meeting of the Hanseatic, the League's assembly, was called in Lübeck in 1669. These assemblies had been irregular for decades. Sometimes 15 or 20 years passed between sessions. But 1669 was different. Only 9 cities sent representatives, not 200. 9. They conducted routine business. They discussed outstanding debts. They noted a few administrative matters. They passed no formal dissolution decree. No member stood up and announced that the League was finished. When the meeting ended, the delegates went home. They never met again. The most powerful commercial organization in European history did not burn. It did not surrender. It did not end with a treaty or a battle or a moment that history could point to. It ended with a meeting that was simply never rescheduled. And no contemporary source treated 1669 as significant. No eulogy, no monument, no post-mortem examining what had been lost. The League faded so gradually, so quietly, that the world forgot to mark the moment of its ending. What replaced it was loud by comparison. Nation-states with flags and constitutions and standing armies. Royal trading companies with government charters and shareholder structures. Central banks issuing currency on behalf of sovereigns. All of it visible. All of it insistent on being the future. And next to that noise, 4 centuries of stateless commerce simply receded until it disappeared from common knowledge entirely. When the architects of the European Union were designing its foundational trade architecture in the 1940s and 50s, a voluntary commercial union between sovereign entities operating under shared rules without a true central government, with economic exclusion as the ultimate enforcement mechanism, they explicitly studied the Hanseatic model. European economists and legal theorists referenced the Hanse directly, because it had already been built, it had already been tested, it had already run for 428 years. The EU is, in many respects, a bureaucratic version of what the League had already done without bureaucracy, with a parliament, with a commission, with a flag and an anthem, and all the visible apparatus of a state that the Hanse deliberately never needed. Whether that makes the European Union the successor to the Hanseatic League or the replacement of it, that question depends on what you believe central authority actually does to voluntary cooperation, whether it protects it or slowly consumes it. 3 cities never stopped calling themselves Hanseatic. Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck still carry the designation in their official legal names today. Hamburg's full legal name on every government document, every court filing, every official correspondence is the free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg. Not as nostalgia, not as branding, because there was never a formal moment of surrender, because the League ended without ending, because when something dissolves by silence, the name outlasts the institution almost indefinitely. The Steelyard in London is a street name now. The compound is gone. The warehouses are gone. The merchants are gone. The ledgers recording 4 centuries of transactions are scattered across archives in Lübeck, Hamburg, and Gdansk. mostly untranslated, mostly unread. But the cities remain, and they kept the name. The most successful commercial network in European history dissolved itself so quietly that the world forgot to ask what was lost. The question isn't just what the Hanseatic League was. The question is what it proved: that voluntary cooperation between equals, without a government above them, can outlast kingdoms, survive wars, and build an economy that feeds an entire continent for 400 years. And whether that proof simply vanished with the last assembly in 1669, or whether it's still sitting in the name of a city, waiting for someone to ask what it actually means. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe. These are the stories that history mentions in footnotes. We're making them the headline.